Welcome to the Normal and Heroic Koragh Raid Guide. And to answer your first question, no, I have no idea what that armor he's wearing is, or why it's chained, or why the chain has no textures. To start, we'll go over the 4 different expel magics that Koragh will cast throughout this encounter. The first is going to be Fire, and this quite simply is a fire dot that he places on your entire raid, and everyone needs to spread out within 5 yards. After a few seconds the dot expires and explodes, doing damage to anyone within 5 yards, so just spread out 5 yards. There's plenty of room, so this really shouldn't be much of a problem at all. Alright, the next expel magic is going to be Frost. For this, Koragh will spawn a Frost Orb over a random player, which will do a significant amount of raid damage, and you might want to consider popping a cooldown here, though it's not necessary. And it'll also slow movement speed while the orb is up. If anyone is standing under it, and chances are there will be at least one person under it, you'll want to use some kind of movement increase, like a Stampeding Roar or Aspect of the Cheetah. Also Freedoms and Master's Calls will also remove the slow effect, especially for your soakers, which we'll get into later, but your soakers will need to be able to have free movement in order to get to the orbs they're supposed to soak. Next we have Shadow. For this, Koragh simply puts a giant heal absorption on all of the players in your raid. You'll definitely want to set up a raid cooldown rotation ahead of time for this. This is when you're going to want to use your tranks and your revivals and whatever healing cooldowns you have available. You want to remove this as fast as possible because there is a lot of random raid-wide damage that goes out, and you'll need to make sure you can heal people up and top them off before those effects go out. The last expel magic you'll have to deal with is Arcane. And really only the tanks will need to worry about this if it's done properly. So Koragh will mark whichever tank is his current target with an arcane debuff that will cause that tank to explode at his current location about 1.5 seconds after the location itself is marked. Which means that the tank will have to just run around in a circle, basically, and let the locations that he's run through explode before returning to them. So the big problem with this is if anyone else is standing in these circles, because they might not be aware that the tanks are running through them with the debuff. Which means that the best way to handle it is to predetermine a path for your tanks. The way we do this is by tanking the boss on the stairs, and whenever one of the tanks gets the debuff, he just runs up and around on the stairs, letting the debuff explode behind him as he's running. This way, none of our healers, tanks, DPS, anything are up on the stairs, so he has a free path to run through, and no one else is randomly going to get killed. Now, besides all the expel magic you'll have to deal with, there's also going to be overflowing energy. And this is orbs falling from the ceiling that are going to try and touch the ground and explode, doing a ton of raid damage. And if more than 3 or 4 of these hits the ground at once, it's probably going to be a raid wipe, especially if you're unprepared. The way you handle this is by sending someone into the swirly on the ground to soak the orb. Now, the orb will do all of its damage to that one player if it hits that player before hitting the ground, which obviously would kill that player. It pierces through all damage immunities and damage reduction effects, so you can't soak it with bubbles or deterrences or anything like that. The only way to do it is by gaining the shield, which we'll talk about in a minute. So you have designated players with these shields, and they will need to run around and soak these orbs before they hit the ground. However, there will always be one orb that you cannot soak. So early on the fight, there'll be one orb falling by itself, but you won't have anyone with a shield to soak it. As soon as that first person gets a shield, there'll be 2 orbs falling, so that one person can soak one, but then the other one won't be soaked. And they all do fall at the same time, so you can't try to soak one and then soak another. When you get later in the fight and there's 4 or 5 orbs falling at once, they don't all start to fall at the same time, if that makes sense. They don't all spawn. So one will spawn in some corner of the room, then another one a few seconds later will spawn in the middle or something like that. So if you're panicking because you can't find one, don't worry, just wait a few seconds and one will pop up somewhere. You also want to try and pay attention to where your raid is in accordance to where these orbs are spawning, because you don't want to try and be soaking an orb in the way back where you're out of range of healers and you're out of range of actually attacking the boss. You'd want to try and pick ones that are close to the group. Obviously this isn't always avoidable, but when it is, try and avoid it. Alright, next we have the Suppression Field. So Koragh will occasionally cast this ability, which is targeted at a player, and he will charge that player and smack the ground with his mace. This will leave behind an area of effect that does damage to anyone standing in it and also silences anything in it. Importantly, this also silences volatile anomalies, which are adds that spawn later in the fight. So you'll want to make sure that you have these in an appropriate position that you can use these later in the fight. Also, you want to make sure that none of these are in the direct center of the room where you have players soaking the shield. Otherwise it's going to be just that much more damage that they have to take while they're getting the shield. Alright, now we're going to talk about the Nullification Barrier. This is the shield that Koragh has, as you can see on the little white bar underneath his nameplate. And if you have the default Blizzard UI, you should have a little boss bar pop up next to his nameplate also, which will indicate the actual shield level. Now what this is quite simply a shield that absorbs all magic damage. So it's about 12 million HP, and you need to break this shield multiple times throughout this fight, which is the reason why you'll need to bring a balance of physical and magical damage. Now once this shield is broken, he'll go back into the center of the room and charge up that shield. And while he's doing this, another player goes in with him to absorb the shield, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the nullification barrier itself, it does have some quirkiness to it. For example, when the shield gets into the normal execute range, like 30% or 20% depending on your execute, it'll actually trigger it so that, like, a hunter, for example, can use kill shot even though the boss's physical health is above 30%. His shield is below it, so you can use executes. So just make sure you take advantage of that when you can. Alright. Now that the nullification barrier is broken, the boss is going to go into the middle of the room, and he's going to start casting his shield buff that will give him his shield back. Once he starts this, you're going to have a player step inside with him in order to gain the shield for himself. While he's in there, he's going to be taking a huge amount of damage and taking a reduced amount of healing. So you need to make sure he gets plenty and plenty of heals. It's going to pierce all damage reduction effects and all immunities, so he will just need direct healing. The way we did it is generally we had assigned ahead of time which healers were going to focus which players that went inside, just to make sure that they got plenty of heals. Now while the boss is in the middle of the room charging up his next shield, 3 adds are going to be spawning in 3 waves around him that you'll need to have a tank pick up. Now when these adds die, they explode for a huge amount of damage to your entire raid. So you need to make sure that they get all grouped up. Once all 9 are out, you group them up inside one of the suppression fields and have them AoE down quickly. Once they're in the suppression fields, they'll be silenced and they won't explode doing a huge amount of raid damage. Another possibility is you can stack up and pop some healing cooldowns, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Death Knights are really good for this, monks are pretty good for this too, because the tanks that, if they have to go inside the suppression field, they're going to be taking a huge amount of damage. Another option is to have the tank stand in the front and get light grip behind it. It's also very useful. And you want to make sure you have a set stuns for it. Hunter binding shots or the warlocks that have the AoE stuns. Paladins can do this too. Prop paladins, if they have the Holy Wrath glyph. You just want to make sure that they get stunned inside of the suppression. If they get stunned outside and get nuked down, it's just going to be that much more raid damage. If a few go off, it's really not that big a deal, but if more than half of them go off, let's say, it's going to be a huge amount of damage that your healers are going to have to pick up. Alright, now the last thing we have to talk about is Breaker Strength. So while the boss has his nullification barrier up, he's going to be gaining stacks of a buff called Breaker Strength, which is 8% increased damage done. And your tanks will just want to be aware of this. If he gets really high stacks because your magic damage is low, you might want to swap off tanking for whoever's got cooldowns up, just to make sure neither of your tanks are getting one shot. If either of your tanks are getting one shot because there's too many Breaker Strength stacks, that means you don't have anywhere near enough magic damage in your raid, so you might want to go recruit some mages. Or hunters. I know they're not magic damage, but you should probably just recruit a lot of hunters, they're pretty good. Alright, on to positioning. So you just want to tank the boss at the foot of the stairs, so that your tanks are on the stairs and your melee DPS aren't. And then you want to have your ranged DPS and healers just spread out throughout the room to make sure they're within range of the boss, but they don't want to be standing in the direct center of the room, where the boss is going to be going to gain his nullification barrier, because you don't want any suppression fields there, because then the people absorbing the shield will have extra damage they have to deal with. Now, the reason you're going to take the boss right at the foot of the stairs is just to make the Expel Magic Arcane a joke, basically. Whichever tank gets it, the other tank's going to taunt off, and the tank with the Arcane is going to run up and around on the stairs, so that all the explosions will be on the stairs, and absolutely nowhere near any melee DPS. And there should be no ranged DPS or healers up there either. There's plenty of room for them to spread out in the rest of the room. Now, when there's when there's orbs falling from the ground, there's going to be... They're not all going to spawn at once, they're going to spawn apart from each other. So you want to make sure that you are soaking the ones that are closest to the boss, and if you absolutely have to soak one that's really, really far away, you can actually look up at the ceiling to see when the ball starts dropping, and then go out to soak it, rather than just going out ahead of time and just sitting there until it starts falling. This way you can keep as much uptime on the boss as possible. Okay, so this boss, when you break it down, is basically just repeating the same thing over and over again until it dies. So you just have everyone spread out for the Expel Magic Fire. When the shadow goes out, just make sure you pop a healer cooldown, and you have a rotation set up ahead of time. Make sure you pop a healer cooldown to bring everybody up and to get the absorb off of everyone, especially tanks. And when the frost goes out, make sure you top off whoever took the big hits from the damage, and make sure that everybody gets out of the frost orb as fast as possible. Stampeding roars work for this, disengages, blinks, anything like that will get you out of it. Also freedoms, master's calls, there's plenty of options. When the arcane goes out, the tanks just need to make sure that they run it up and around the stairs and that nobody is getting hit by it. There really shouldn't be anybody up on the stairs, so that shouldn't be a problem. You want to make sure your ranged and healers are spread out around the room so that the suppression fields aren't in the middle. You want to keep them along the edge of that big circle in the middle, because the boss, or when the boss goes in the middle and he's getting his shield, there's going to be the ads spawning, and your tank's going to have to run around and pick up all those ads. So if he has to run through suppression fields, he's going to be taking even more damage, because the ads actually melee for quite a bit of damage. And they melee for magic damage, actually, which is quite interesting. It's not actually physical. But anyway, once all those ads are picked up by your tank, make sure he drags them all into a suppression field and that they get stunned, and then just have your ranged DPS nuke them down. You can have melee help, but they just need to make sure that they don't melee them and get into the suppression field and die. We had warriors doing it for a long time, but they tended to just blade storm and then die in the suppression field, so if your warriors can not do that, by all means have them do it, otherwise just let your ranged nuke them down. Speaking of which, you'll need to make sure you have a balance of physical and a balance of magical DPS, more about half and half, so this way that you get the right amount of shields, the right amount of people absorbing orbs, and you are actually able to kill the boss before the berserk timer. That's pretty much it. Make sure that you have a rotation ahead of time for who's going to get the shields, and that you have enough people to do it. You'll want 4, maybe 5 for a backup. And you just want to make sure that those players know what they're doing with soaking the orbs. You just have to find where these little swirlies are on the ground, and then make sure you get into that swirly before the orb falls and hits the ground. There'll always be at least one orb hitting the ground too, so make sure your healers are prepared for that damage. 1, even 2 is definitely healable. You just need to make sure that there aren't more than that. When you get near the end, if it's getting close to a kill but it's starting to get messy, don't forget you can always sacrifice your magical DPS in one of those swirlies on the ground. They will die, but the raid won't take the damage. Once you get that 4th shield down, if you get a 5th one, it's going to be a wipe. I can pretty much guarantee it. So at that point, after the 4th shield is broken, the magic DPS is pretty much pointless, and you can just have them sack themselves inside the orbs so that the rest of the raid can survive, because you just need at that point for your physical damage to live long enough to kill it. But yeah, that is essentially the fight. Thanks for watching my normal and heroic Koragh guide. If you like what you saw, feel free to subscribe so you can get the rest of my guides. The Blackrock Foundry guides, they're coming out soon. Like I said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.